Welcome to the talk about CMI 2.0 and how you can do this today already. My name is Fabian Bircher, or Bircher on Drupal.org. I work for a company called Nuvole. We're a 100% Drupal company, more or less. Also working on Symfony and other things, so it's not really only Drupal. But we're a remote team working from Italy, Belgium, and Czech Republic. Quickly, our clients are mostly institutions and international organizations, and they often need fast delivery, and so multiple developers working on the same project, and frequent changes to configuration, and we need a safe way to deploy this thing. I'm showing this because Nuvole has been a pioneer in the configuration management since more than 10 years ago, and it's still relevant. In this presentation, I will give a current update of what is in Drupal core, what contrib solutions are, and why there is the Configuration Management Initiative 2.0, and like interleaving a bit of these things. Just out of curiosity, show of hands, who has been at my presentation in Drupalcon Vienna? Okay, a fair bit. Great. I got good feedback from that session, but also that some of the parts, they were quite complex. And so in this presentation, a lot of these things I repeat again, but in like the light of the CMI 2.0. But I will nonetheless like show you or try to explain again so that you understand the concepts maybe better, and so maybe some of it is repetition. Before we start the presentation, I would like to thank the sponsors of this event, without whom it would not have been possible. So, Diamond sponsor, Platinum sponsors, and Gold sponsors. Thank you for the sponsors. So, Chapter 1, Configuration Management in Drupal core. The way Drupal core has evolved since Drupal 7 is in many ways, and the topic that interests me the most and that has affected, I think, our development workflow the most is configuration management. And it's a really good thing for the thing that it's designed for. And the question it tries to answer is, can I test and develop configuration on a development environment and then push it to production? And so we will see. Okay. Yeah. Or we will not. Fantastic. Yeah. And the rest of the slides seem not to be here. I don't know. Okay. So. Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, I will switch back to this, and then we will just have to live with the screen flicking off and on, because this is an empty presentation now. Yeah. Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I don't know. I tried to set up the projector before, and then it worked for a short while, and then it stopped working again. So for other presenters, like, try to do this way ahead and not just 15 minutes. Huh? I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, just try to listen to me, and I will try to explain it even with the slides flickering. So the configuration management in Drupal core, there's a active configuration storage, and it is in the database, and you can read the configuration from it, and you can, on the other hand, access the configuration for writing it. So probably the slides will also show up, but the key concept is that you have this API that you can read configuration from and you can write to. And this is very important because it is the API that all of Drupal core uses, and that you can also use in your development. So when you develop and you want to have something that is configuration, and then you can use this API. The difference of configuration between other things in Drupal is that the configuration you want to deploy. So when you have something that, a setting that you want to save somewhere, and you want to have this made on your development, and then you want to safely deploy to production, then it's configuration. So if you think about it, if a developer changes it, it's configuration. If an editor changes it, it's content. And if the system, like cron, changes it, it's state, usually. Drupal 8 core has also a way of synchronizing configuration. So you have this database storage, and you can export to a file storage, and you can import from this file storage. You can also deploy configuration, which is basically the same. You have in your site that has the live database, you export the configuration to your files, you add the files to Git, you deploy with Git to another environment, and then from there you import them again into the database of the site, the same site in the new environment. And it doesn't need to be only one way. The other environment could also be the laptop of your colleague. So this synchronization works in both ways. Yeah. Okay, so does this solve everything? Configuration management done? Great. It does solve this use case, and it solves this use case very well. Yeah. And the answer is yes, for this use case, it works really well. We have been using this on all our projects, and it works actually really surprisingly nicely. But in the real life situations, there's more things to it. So there's more scenarios to cover, and this is where CMI 2.0 comes in. CMI 2.0 has three major focus areas, let's say. The first one is the horizontal workflow. So, or vertical. I think I mixed up. It doesn't matter. The important part is that it's two dimensions. So one is the workflow of managing configuration between the same site in different environments. And the same site, I mean, the same site UUID, the same kind of content. So you're working on the same site. It is meant to have the same content. It is just a development environment of the same site. So this is one way. And the configuration management that is currently in core is made to address this use case. It is from one environment to the next in the same site. And the other one is configuration management between different sites. It's a very different topic, and when you think about configuration and sharing configuration, they're different things. So if you work on one site with different teams and different developers, you use one way of workflow, the one that Drupal core comes with. And if you want to share configuration, for example, if you maintain a distribution or multi-site, or if you have features that you want to have on other sites and you want to share them, then that's a very, like an orthogonal different thing. It's not meant to be the configuration management that is currently in Drupal core. It's a different problem space. And so the configuration management 2.0 is trying to address both of these, because both of them have major pain points still. So the one workflow is the same site, and you switch, and the other one is different sites. Okay? And the third part is also really important, and is the documentation. And this may seem obvious, but it's crucial that we make good documentation and not just say, oh, Drupal has all these options, and you can do all of these things. But then we don't really know, like you come new to it and you're seeing all of these options. It's maybe confusing to know like how exactly you're supposed to using it. There are two parts. One is you as a developer, when you write a module, like when should you use configuration and how? And the other one is as a user for this workflow, for developers or site builders or managers. And I think we should have a more opinionated documentation that says this is the best practice, and not these are the 10 practices and choose from one. And it's related to what Bojan said in the keynote, this friction. And I think there's also the documentation initiative, and there's a good opportunity to share efforts there. So the first part in the using the configuration for the same site is the installing from existing configuration. So the workflow that's currently in core assumes that you have already two sites in different environments. And how you get there is with the dump of the database, but of course we want to avoid that. So there's the custom profile called config installer, and in my opinion should be used on every Drupal 8.5 project or before. But because when you install a site, like when you go to the installer and you select the profile that you want, then Drupal creates a new site. So a new site UUID with its unique configuration UUIDs that you can then customize. And the configuration installer takes over this part and makes your Drupal site think it is a clone of the other site without needing the database of everything. The first and already win for the configuration management initiative is to put this in core. And the first step is to allow profiles to have real dependencies, because right now, like for example in Drupal 8.5, you can have standard, and then you can uninstall modules that come with standard, like the contact module. But then you cannot install standard, which depends on contact, but contact is not meant to be enabled, and then it's like, oh, you can't enable it because the module is not there. So this is solved in Drupal 8.6. Modules will have real dependencies and a list of modules that you can disable. The next one is like an intermediate step to install a site-specific module to be installed, site-specific profile to be installed. In this workflow, you would create a new profile that is very specific to your site. So the site that runs is part of the profile that you install. So for every site, you would create a new profile. This is very different from a starter kit profile or a distribution that you want to install many times. And in this case, the sync directory that I showed before in green is part of the profile. But if you want to use this with, for example, minimal, then you would have to symlink the config sync directory into the profile, and we want to not document that and make that the recommended way of doing things. So the next step is to allow a site to be installed from configuration if the configuration directory is already known, like in settings.php, and it's not empty and it contains the information of, like it is a exported configuration. Then the last step is we need to fix the hook install, because this process before is limited to profiles that do not have hook installs. The problem with this is hook installs, they are usually run so far at the last point of an installation of the profile. So all the configuration is there, all the modules are enabled, everything. So a hook install of a profile can assume everything is there. But when you synchronize configuration, this is also important for modules, then the module is installed first and then the configuration is imported. So when the hook is called, the configuration is all not there and the database is not there yet, so it will fail horribly. So to get this done, we excluded this use case and we add this use case back in a later step. Since this is an API edition anyway, we decided to take the complexity out to have it easier to get done. Yeah. Then this is part of the other Drupalcon presentations is environment-specific configuration. So in the same site, you want to have different configuration per environment. The Drupal 8 core already comes with a configuration override system. It's meant to be used in, for example, settings.php with this config variable, and you can specify, you can override the configuration there. So, for example, the system logging, the error level, you can set it to verbose, and then even though in your configuration it says it should only log minimal, then on your development it can log everything. So this is the little asterisk. When you read from the configuration storage, it will apply all the all the overrides. And that's why it's important that there's two different things. One is when you consume, when you read the configuration, and one is when you want to update it. So you want, when you, in a form, for example, you want to have the configuration that is not overridden. So, so that you can save it and you don't bleed the overrides into the configuration that you then save. And this works quite well for a limited use case. For example, you cannot override which modules are enabled. You cannot override anything that gets compiled into the container. You cannot override the color of Bartik. That's quite a detail. But you can also not add new configuration or unset configuration entirely with this override things. But the overrides, they're also used, for example, for languages. So the language that is currently active makes the configuration overridden so that you can have a different site name for the different languages and have like the translations. But you cannot control that from a UI. You have them in your settings PHP. And this is where the contrib comes in. There's the config filter module, and it's an import time override of the configuration. So it's not a runtime like the override system in SynCore, but an import time when you synchronize the configuration. So this is the configuration management in core, and this is the configuration management with config filter. So you see it's just a different kind of storage. And configuration filters, they basically apply to every action that the config filter does. And they're plugins, and they're sorted, and then they're executed one after the other in order. And they can be inactive, so they don't are not taken into account. And this module is the API module, and it's used quite a lot, and it didn't receive a lot of bugs. So there was only one that is like an edge case bug so far. So that's pretty good. This is how it works in the end. So as like a schema, when you read and write to it, so when you import and export, like before it's written to the actual file storage, the one that we had from core, filters are applied. So for example, some modules like config split, it has a secondary storage and just writes it there. And config ignore, it takes the active database, and when you read from the sync storage, it just pretends that it contains the values that the active one has, and therefore the things that you want to ignore, they're not overwritten when they're different in the files. So problem solved, we put it in core, job done. I think this is not like the best solution. It's one, but I think if we do it for core, we can do better. And because the filtering at the storage level is very too low level, and it's too verbose, and the filters, they don't know if you're importing or exporting, they just know if you're writing or reading from the configuration storage. And in any case, core needs to have an export API, which it currently doesn't. Might come as a surprise, but the API core now has is downloading a tarball. And the rest is done by Drush or other modules or Drupal console. So in the schema, it would look more like this. And you see, then it can still work together with the config filter. And so in a period of when you upgrade, they will not step on each other's foot, and they should be able to like the new system from core and the old system from contrib can work in parallel. Config split configuration, I will skip this. I will put the slide online. If we have time in the end, or if you have questions, we can always come back to this. So environment-specific modules or configuration. With config split, the other one was just to explain how it like works in detail. You add the modules that you want to have to your split, and then in the environment you override whether the split is active or not. And then if it's active, the modules will be merged in and be active, or they will be enabled when you import it, and when it's not active, they will just be removed or not imported. So that's how you can do this. Environment-specific permissions, there's a very similar module for that does the same things but for permissions. So it splits up permissions in smaller entities, and when you import it, merges them back together. So Drupal core will only see this one permission file, but actually when you save it to the real files, it saves it in several files. If you have production changes, there's different options. So the production is also just another environment, and if you change configuration on production, you're essentially developing on production, right? Because configuration are in files, and they're considered now development since you have them in Git. So the first option is you just don't do it. And there's a module that can help you enforce that, but often that's not very practical, and often the configuration needs to change on production. So you can either use config split or config ignore to address this. And I'm trying to skip a little bit faster over this, but you can come to me later as well and ask questions on this. So with the CMI 2.0, we're trying to gather the basic use cases, like the thing, the config split or config ignore, or there's a whole ecosystem of modules that work with this. We're trying to find out which ones are the most common use cases, which one should core support. I invite you all to come to the sprints later and discuss this with us to find out what is going on. And so the last chapter, and probably the most interesting one, because it's like this whole new dimension that core doesn't currently take care of. So reusing configuration on different sites for distributions or multi-site and so on. And there's issues that deal with this that are old enough to go to kindergarten. So it's not a new problem, but for the sake of releasing Drupal 8.0, they were excluded from this because the other one was already a huge win, and we needed to have at least some configuration management in core. And now we're here to address also the rest, or a selected few of these use cases. So the typical way of doing this, and this is the original intent of features, is to package configuration. And it works great for starter kits to optionally enable new features. But since the site owns the configuration and not the module, when you install a feature or any module, the configuration is merged, copied into the active configuration, and then you export this active configuration, and the module's configuration is never treated or regarded anymore. Actually, when it is imported into the active configuration, some changes are made to it. For example, a UUID is added if it's not there, and some other things, like a core hash and so on. So like features itself solves only half of the problem, because you cannot update a distribution like this. The other option that you have are update hooks, right? Update hooks, you know them since Drupal, I don't know, forever. And you can execute code that is executed only once. The problem with update hooks is they're not made for configuration updates. They're made first and foremost to put the database back into a state that it can work with the files that you currently have. So when you change the code, you need to make sure that the database is in a state to be able to read, or that the code is able to read from the database. So you need to update the database so that Drupal can work again. And so they're not mandatory. They're not optional. They need to run. And it's the first thing that needs to run. So you do composer install, and then you do run all the update hooks. Because when you composer install, you might get new modules because the config, the composer log has changed from your colleague. And then you need to update the database. And you need to have update hooks to change the configuration if, for example, your configuration schema has changed. So if the schema of your configuration changes, you need to make sure that the configuration adheres to this new schema. So that's when you need update hooks. But you should not use update hooks to change something that is not really like a necessity. Because users, they cannot opt in or opt out of update hooks. And there's no UI to choose that. It runs, and it's not optional. And yeah, so you need to be extra careful because you have to like check what is there, and yeah, so not super amazing. So that's why I created this small module out of another module called config sync, and it's meant as a proof of concept, or a way of how you can deal with this. And it essentially gives you the same UI as the configuration import does. So when you import the configuration from your files, it shows you like what is new, what gets deleted, what are the diffs. And this does the same, but from all the distribution, from all the modules that are enabled and that have new configuration. And the config distro in itself doesn't actually do any of the hard work. It just provides you the UI and this workflow of updating configuration from distribution. It's not opinionated of how you get there, but it's the idea is that you have this other dimension that core currently doesn't have. So in the schema, it would look like this. So you import from like this other pink configuration storage. And internally, it looks the same as the config filter because essentially it's just the same. And so the config distro filters, they're plugins, they're the same plugins that you would use for the other one. Currently, they're only provided by config sync and config merge. Maybe there's other ones in the meantime already, but these are the two that I'm aware of. And there's an update helper module that came out of the Thunder distribution that essentially creates a config patch that is to be applied. And I'm planning to make like a bridge between config distro and update helper module so that config distro can apply the patch. And then you can opt in or opt out because it's a UI, and you can say, no, I want to not have this. Because config distro also comes with the config distro ignore that allows you to like opt out of the updates that come from the distribution. And a lot of the heavy lifting is done by the config update module, which is like at the base of all these modules that deal with this dimension of sharing configuration. So the goals of the CMI2, just to summarize, is recruit as many people as we can, so join us, especially if you have use cases that I now kind of covered. We want to hear from you which things core needs to absolutely provide and where we can just have the API that then you can build your own things. For now, like in 8.6, we will have the installer, or hopefully the full installation profile for profiles that don't have install hooks. Then for 8.7, we target the kind of the config filter in core, but new and in an improved way. And then later we tackle the kind of this new dimension of configuration with different sites. And this is mainly because the contrib solutions for this configuration management between the same site, so in different environments, is much more mature than the other dimension. And if you're using a distribution or if you're developing a distribution, I would like to invite you to join efforts and try out the config distro. The idea is to incubate ideas on how core can support this workflow better to deal with configuration from distributions or from module updates and so on. So thanks for attending my session. And sorry for the technical problems that now fortunately are solved. Are there any questions? Yes. No, there's nothing wrong with features. And actually, the config distro will work with features. So the Netio Rogers made like this huge list of contrib modules that work together to support this kind of use case. And it works with features. So if you have a feature, then config distro allows you to like import the updated configuration from all the features. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Me, and Alex Pott and Mladen, and there are a few others that join our calls. We have bi-weekly calls for Google Hangouts. They're public. You can also join them. Are here, and we will try to architect some of these solutions that we can then start implementing. I don't know exactly where we will be, but I'm usually not very hard to find, so yeah, we will be here. And I will only be here until tomorrow evening, so, but Alex Pott is amazing, and he will be here the whole week. Other questions? No? Yeah. Yeah, so Drupal core needs or should have a way of dealing with updated configuration from modules or packages or distributions. And currently, it doesn't at all. And config distro is one way, and it's a very unopinionated way, and it's a very similar way as the UI that core currently has. Actually, it extends the core classes, even their internal classes. But the plan is to move the config distro into core, and so that they will, it would be in core. But I don't know if it will be as a separate module, but probably because already the config module that is in core is optional. So the UI that allows you to import the configuration is optional in core. And I think this will be similar. And if you have a distribution or you have a site that you have only the live site and you just update from the distribution, then maybe you will only want to have this UI. But right now it's literally the same UI. And it just, instead of reading from the files and showing you the diff, it reads from the active storage and applies filters that update the active storage based on the updates that happened in your modules. But it's quite a complex thing. So, like for example, with the update helper, which creates a patch, it would be much easier to do. And there's several ways of how this can go. But yeah. Yes.
You say that filtering storage is long enough. Can you explain?
Yeah. So the current config filter plugins, they apply to every operation that happens to the storage. So a storage, you can read all, you can exists, you can delete, you can like all of these things. And in all of these operations, you don't know the intent of what is happening with the storage. It's just the storage is there, and some other, like the caller of the storage, wants to read the configuration or wants to write to it. But you don't know if you're exporting or importing. And this is important because, for example, the export, what it does is it deletes all the configuration, and then it writes all the configuration. And if you make a filter, you have to be aware of that, because the delete happens first. So if you have like some other, you save whatever happens in between, or you do your custom thing, the export operation is not just writing to the configuration. It's first deleting all the configuration. And maybe there's also like a list all the configuration, or there's not an API for that. You don't know, you just know because Drush does it in a certain way, which steps you need to do to, like, what could have been like an export event or an import one. The same for reading as well. Like, which of the methods are being called, by trying out. And this is why I think it's too low level, because if you want to have like a proper API for this, it should be like, this configuration is being imported. Do you want to do something with it? or this configuration is being exported, do you want to do something with it before it's written to the storage? Yes. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Thank you all for coming, and see you at the sprint, and I'm looking forward to more discussions about this topic. Thank you very much.